Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Dr. Chris Avis, my occasional co-host and good friend, joins us today as well to help us make this important conversation count. We live in a complex, easily manipulable, and massively engineered information environment. We've trusted large, often amoral corporations with hosting and profiting off of our societal discourse with very little in the way of safeguards and regulation. Meta, X, TikTok, Truth Social, Reddit, and others, these corporations in particular have vast and too often unchecked ability to skew our culture's conversations and have therefore had an outsized and sometimes dystopian impact on where we've ended up these last 15 years. The results, I think, speak for themselves. Online forums have become the town square, the neighborhood barbershop, the church confessional, the singles bar, even the nightly dinner table, and their algorithms are quietly and aggressively shaping public opinion in a way that conforms to their interest and financial needs. One company of this type seems to bear the most stigma as a Wild West kind of informational freak show, yet this one entity, Reddit, to my mind is actually the best at keeping the long-running community conversations somewhere near the intent of most of its users. Is it perfect? Not by a long shot. But by assigning each subreddit a real human group of moderators, people not employed by the company but very interested most of the time in enabling useful dialogue, they seem to have avoided the Orwellian vibes I sense on so many other platforms. Around the UAP topic, in particular, Reddit has become one of the most important and widely accessible avenues for information and debate. Yet this model in recent years is increasingly under siege by bots and other malefactors seeking to shape or distort the public's interest in this highly controversial subject matter. The moderators thus become even more important in protecting and preserving these exchanges. Our guest today is Charles, known on Reddit as MantisAwakening, who is a well-known moderator on the Experiencers subreddit. We're here to ask about his own story as an experiencer, his role as subreddit referee, and what that process looks like, and how he's seen evidence of manipulation and information management in the threads he monitors. This sub has undoubtedly been a lifeline to thousands of people who thought they were alone in their experiences and had no community to turn to for support. I've read all kinds of stories in these threads, some beautiful, some horrific. So the protected space r/experiencers offers is undoubtedly a pivotal place for individual disclosure, for those seeking guidance in a strange new universe, and for allowing everyone an unfiltered opportunity to gaze into the abyss. We'll talk about all of that. This is an important conversation for the topic of UAPs, UFOs, and NHI, as well as for every other subject of interest in the digital world. We have largely lost the ability to maintain a civil discourse, and that seems increasingly by design. How can we have these deep and transformative conversations when we're lost and stuttering in a hall of hazy mirrors? Welcome, Charles and Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
I deeply appreciate the work you do, Charles. I've been on the Reddits. You know, there's seems like four subreddits in particular that really foster this conversation. And recently, you guys have even kind of combined to form a Voltron of like super subreddit for AMAs and whatnot. And we can talk about that as well. But first, I wanted to get a little bit about your own personal experience with the anomalous. Can you talk about how you came to consider yourself an experiencer and what your interaction with the anomalous has looked like over your life?
I wish it was a simple answer.
Of course.
Going back, I think kind of the first big experience that I had was when I was 6, and I was out walking with my sister, middle of the day, right after lunch. We walked by a cornfield, and for some reason I felt the need to go into the cornfield. My sister opted to stay behind, and I wandered in, cut over a few rows, and found myself standing face to face, like only a couple feet away from what I perceived at the time as a giant grasshopper. It was a little bit taller than I was. And it had hands, and it was on the corn on either side, kind of gripping its fingers around it and slowly pushing it apart. And I don't think I was there very long. I looked at it, took off in absolute terror, tried to explain to my sister what had happened, to the babysitter who was watching us at the time. And for the rest of my life, I was just like, I don't know. I saw a giant grasshopper when I was a kid. Like, it was such a very realistic experience. I knew it wasn't like a dream or anything. But what do you do with something like that? And I'd had some other, kind of random experiences, you see a ghost or, there was a time when a radio turned on that didn't have any batteries in it. A friend was with me at the time, so I knew it wasn't just like me misremembering something. But it wasn't until 2020 when I really started to pay attention to it. Because before that, I was always just sort of very analytical, skeptical. I know everyone says they're a skeptic, but, genuinely trying to figure it all out. And for the things I couldn't, I would just set them aside and be like, I don't know. Uh, but in 2020, I started experiencing unusual things like synchronicities. An example was the first time I tried to use a tarot deck. I pulled the same card 4 times in a row. And the odds of that are like 1 in 479,000 or something. And it was the Fool, which is talking about like, an uninitiated journey of knowledge or something. Um, and then I had a precognitive dream. And then meanwhile, I'm like reading and trying to learn about all this stuff. And so I was like reading books and watching videos, and I'm learning about remote viewing. And so I was like, you know what? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go on Reddit. I'm going to create an account, which is MantisAwakening. And I was like, I'm going to go onto the tarot subreddit and I'm going to try doing readings for people and get feedback and see, like, do they rate this stuff that I'm being as accurate as well as I think I am? And I did this reading for this guy, and he was like, yeah, that was pretty good. And I was like, yeah, it's subjective, whatever. But then I had this urge. I was like, could I try doing a remote viewing for you? And he was like, sure, yeah, I've heard of that. And so I was like, okay, you're like on a low bed, and the door is here, and there's a bookcase here, and there's a piece of art on the wall here, and it looks like this. And I like described the layout of the room. And afterwards he was like, oh my God, that every single thing you said was correct. Like it was 100% accurate. And granted, this was not like following remote viewing protocols. I didn't really know enough about it at the time. It was, I guess, clairvoyance. But I was like, how do you even like check to see what are the odds of this, And so I was like, well, think of every other bedroom you've been in, the layout, how many of the details match, and it was really low. So it was like something weird is going on. And I tried more remote viewing and I kept getting hits and the weirder stuff kept happening. And then I started getting what appeared to be instances of mediumship where I was getting messages and I would pass them on and people would be like, how did you know that? Or that's accurate or whatever. But it really didn't kick into kind of high gear until a friend of mine who knew I was like really fascinated with UFOs was like, have you listened to this podcast, Aliens and Artists with Stuart Davis? And he told me to listen to it. And I listened to the episode where Stuart describes his own encounter with a mantis being. And I had never heard of a mantis being. Like, I thought all aliens were like the little gray guys from Communion. So I Googled it, I found a drawing, and I went, oh my God, that's the same thing I saw when I was 6. Like, it looks just like it. And I contacted Stuart. We ended up doing a hypnotic regression. Some wild stuff came out. I ended up doing hypnotic regression with other people who were like not into UFOs, like a local certified licensed hypnotherapist. More of the same stuff came out. And then I started being like, okay, what is this all about? And started exploring that. And things have continued to be weird and wild since then. I continue to do research in an effort to try and understand it. And somewhere along the way, I was communicating with other experiencers, and we were like, we really need a space for this on Reddit. And so we created the experiencers subreddit. And that is the concatenated version. That's the shorter version of what's going on.
You get $10 for the use of that word. First of all, I am tickled by that. But also, when you went through those regressions, was there anything revealed to you that you can share with us about maybe the source from that perspective of where this is coming from for you, or any context that might have provided?
Uh, what came out over about at least half a dozen sessions was lifelong abductions going back to early childhood, involving my family as well. And it was involved some mantis beings and grays. It was kind of the typical experiencer abduction stuff. You know, there's medical experiments going on. There was an instance where I recalled being taken to another planet. I know how weird that sounds. Um, and I was just like, whatever, you know, people confabulate during hypnosis, which is how I was treating all of this, was just sort of like this is curious, but how would I ever validate any of this?
Mhm.
And then when I was a member of the experiencer group, somebody else had mentioned she had been taken to another planet. And so I, like, right afterwards, she hadn't given any details. I was like, okay, try something with me. Write down everything you can remember about it, and I'll do the same. And then we'll send the notes to each other at exactly the same time. And we did. And not only did we describe what appeared to be the same planet, like all of the geographical features were the same, the
Wow.
city looked the same, the construction of the city was the same, the way the buildings looked was the same. I remembered being taken to a tall spire. She remembered being taken to a part of the city where in the distance there was a tall spire. We both remembered going there and having, like, it was a school setting, like we were being taught things. Um, but she described the beings as being more ant-like. And for mine, they were mantis beings. And that person by the name, and I know she's talked about this now, so I can say it was Robin Lasser.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've had her on the show several times.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful person. I am just so fond of Robin.
She's great. Yeah, she's really nice. And so I didn't like, what do you do with something like that? It's not proof of anything, but like, I don't know how to explain it otherwise. And so all of this information that was coming in, I was just like, it answers some questions, but it just creates more questions.
Yeah.
Do I genuinely think I was taken to another planet? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Do I think that I had that experience? I think I did, but I don't like, how do you connect those dots? I have some ideas, but I'm sure we'll get there.
Yeah.
I really
Um,
appreciate you just kind of sitting with the uncertainty with that, which is, I think, a really kind of healthy attitude to the field, like validating that it's something that's real that happened to you. But, I hear that this kind of tension in your share between, your logical brain, working through, odds of things and this felt sense of something that was really real. And I also just really appreciate you finding ways through community to sort of get some validation for those experiences. I think is a really commendable thing. So I just want to express some appreciation for that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And you know, I really went to great lengths to try and validate it in any way I could.
Yeah.
One of the things that I did was I tracked down a woman who was a remote viewer who had actually done contract work for the CIA, and had a reputation as being an excellent remote viewer. And I didn't even give her my real name. Like, I didn't want to give any clues away or anything. And she brought out all of the same kind of stuff that was coming out under my sessions. Again, it's not proof, but I'm like, I was trying everything I could to validate it in any way, or invalidate it either. You can do that too if you want.
yeah. I mean, is there a point though where you can just sit with experiences and not investigate them to determine their objective reality? For some folks, I know that it's kind of a battle of whether or not to continue the search for, verification of their experiences. And so they try to learn to just accept it as something that they can't really fully explain. Where do you find yourself on that sort of continuum? Is there a process you're working toward of acceptance of just sort of the strange irreality of it all, or are you still looking for that piece to be like, now I know that this is, objectively something that actually happened?
Well, I think interestingly, the answer seems to be that it's kind of both, right? Like, if you listen to the kind of the top names in the research on this Jacques Vallée um, and I want to say everybody else, but they all kind of look to Jacques Vallée.
They do.
Bernardo Kastrup, Gary Nolan,
Kripal, Jeff Kripal. Yeah.
Jeffrey Kripal. Yeah, exactly. All of these people have kind of looked at this and they say, we know that something is going on. Like, we have all the evidence that something legitimate is happening. but physically, these things don't make sense. There were the guys from the Defense Intelligence Agency at Skinwalker Ranch who saw werewolves in their backyard. These are high-ranking officials, and they're not the only ones who see that kind of stuff. And they acknowledge, werewolves standing on their hind legs is anatomically impossible. A dog or a wolf could not run like that. So people are seeing something, but how real is it? What does that mean? And then you start questioning, what is the nature of our physical reality?
Exactly
And
right.
that's where the story starts to get really interesting. And
Yeah.
I think that's more where the answers lie, is that our physical reality, when you're dealing with the phenomenon, gets blurry. They may have the ability to conjure, or physical projection. You could think of it that way. It's like, imagine a hologram, but it's physically real. But it also doesn't necessarily have to be happening within our physical space. I was talking with Jim Segala about this recently, and he was saying, he thinks they're taking your consciousness somewhere else, not local consciousness.
Mhm.
And I think all of the evidence kind of supports that. I don't know if it's the right answer, but it does seem to support it pretty well.
Yeah. And that says all kinds of things about our reality that we have to begin to sort of reimagine it from the ground up, because we've gotten this whole, horse before cart before, whatever, wrong for a long time, apparently, if these things turn out to be just that way. Thank you for that. I appreciate you sharing your experiences, and I know that can be personal, and so I appreciate it. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, I mean, Reddit moderators kind of have a mystique about them, like they have some control over the conversation, and no one really knows how it works. Can you give us a sense of what you do as a moderator, or what the other moderators do, what that process looks like for folks, just so they understand the kind of dilemmas that you face as someone who's trying to protect the conversation?
Well, I think the most important thing that the moderators do is they curate a space the way they envision it. They come up with the rules to say, this is how we want the conversation to go, not what we want people to say, but providing an environment that kind of steers it a little bit. The space that we wanted to create was one where people could feel safe talking about this, because that is something that is sorely lacking, because the ridicule factor is so high. And even for people who aren't even looking to ridicule, just, natural innate skepticism, you question. And we didn't want people to feel like they were having to defend their experiences. We just wanted them to be able to talk about it.
Yeah.
And one of the most controversial rules that we have was, we said no debunking. Just don't do it. Even though you might be even trying to help people understand what happened, we know that not everything has to have a prosaic explanation, even if you can come up with one. So let's just leave those for other spaces. The problem, of course, is that this means that, we're not filtering out what people are saying at all. So someone could come in there and just completely make up a wild story and post it, and we don't remove it. We just leave it there. We let the community engage with it, and however they want to do that, short of saying, I think you lied or whatever. Now, if we do have evidence that someone's used AI or something to create a story, we'll remove it. We'll ask the person, could you please just post this in your own words? It's fine if the grammar is not right or everything. Just, we want this to feel as authentic as possible. And so that's one of the biggest things that I think we've done. Now, in terms of being an active moderator, really, it's just are people being rude to each other? We won't allow that. There's certain keywords that we associate with problematic behavior. And so we just watch for those. We don't censor them, but we're just notified, hey, can you just look at this and make sure it looks okay? So we try and keep it pretty hands off. And for the size of the subreddit, we don't have to do a lot of moderation. We try and keep it to a minimum.
So you don't have to scroll through and read every comment or anything like
Oh,
that in
no.
terms of or at least the posts before they, I mean, obviously they go straight up, but sometimes like with, I know with the UFO subreddit, there might be if you don't do something right off the bat, they might get removed in half an hour if there's a moderator who's around, I guess. I don't know exactly how it works.
Well, there's what's called the auto moderator, where you can tell it, look for this, and then perform an action. So you could theoretically remove it, but what we do is we filter it. We'll put it into the queue to have someone look at it. So if there's certain keywords that we know, well, one of the things we had to do is we had to say, please don't post body marks. Put them on a different subreddit that we created. Because when they're here, people cannot help but try and debunk them. Like everyone wants to solve what could have done that. And you don't ever have enough information to do that accurately. It's just you're engaging the pareidolia pattern matching portion of your brain and going, does this look like something I've ever seen before? Yes, then that's probably what it is, which is not really ideal.
Or helpful in that situation, right? I mean,
right.
Yeah.
And you can
Chris,
carry it to great lengths. Like I think Mick West kind of falls
yes,
prey to
exactly
that
right.
in a lot of ways. Yeah, because all he'll do is he only wants to look at the photos of the videos, and he ignores the other data that he's told exists, by reliable, reputable people. And so it's really hard not to fall victim to that.
Admitted on a recent thing with Merrick von Rennenkamp that he gets paid to debunk. So
But
that's
I
interesting.
do want to come to his
Please do. If I
his
misunderstand
aid in
that,
this
just straighten me
regard.
out. Yeah.
This had come out before, and
Mhm.
really he got funding to help develop this program called SITREC, where you can put in all of these variables for what data you do have for like an unknown object, and it will try and give you more information about could it have been a plane, or how far away might it have been, or what. Somebody funded that, and part of the deal was that he was not supposed to reveal who. My guess would be something related to Arrow, maybe, but I don't know.
That's still kind of shady, though, right? I mean,
I
I mean, he does say he's not being paid to propose a specific position, and I
yeah.
believe him on that. I think he's naturally just very resistant to this.
I
Chris, you
really
had a question?
appreciate, yeah, I really appreciate, first of all, the creation of a dedicated safe space intentionally. I think it's a really important thing to have, and we could do more of that in the community where it's like, this is the parameters if you enter this space and being very clear and transparent about like what expectations are. I wonder a little bit more. The other thing I see within this whole field on certain hot button topics like Jake Barber or the telepathy tapes and such is that in more mixed forums, which do not explicitly have that kind of no debunking rule, or which is ostensibly open to more varied discussions, I see a lot of discussions that start promisingly and then it just seem to devolve into two sides not really hearing one another. And so I wonder, like, how do we set up rules for discussion that allows both people to kind of feel safe? Because I kind of see this in society in general. Like we can't come up to kind of a middle ground or even sit with uncomfortable conversations. We just end up polarizing further. So do you have any thoughts on how to do that so that someone that is skeptical and someone that is a believer can have that kind of healthy dialogue?
What's funny, you mentioned the telepathy tapes because I was recently asked to help moderate that, and I'm doing that for now. Um, and yeah, we're trying to take it back because it had fallen prey to that under the old moderator who could not keep up with the discussion because it was getting so much attention. And we're just telling people like, don't attack each other. Like, try and remain open-minded, which is much more difficult than you would think it should be. All of psychology research shows people don't change their minds if it goes against your worldview. So we just tell people like, uh, if you make a claim, ideally provide a source. Doesn't matter, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be the best source in the world, but any source to just show you're not just making up something and saying that it's a fact when it's opinion. And second, just treat people politely, like pretend you're at a nice dinner party. Like if you said certain things, they'd throw you out of the house. We try and say it's the same kind of thing. Just be on your best behavior and polite and engage with people that way. And it works pretty well.
It's interesting.
Appreciate
I
that.
think, yeah, there's people who are sort of in the game of perception management or trying to disrupt public dialogue or those sorts of things. There's like a list of rules to follow on how to break up coherent and cohesive and cooperative conversations where like it's basically like a series of things you can do. Like you can complain about things, or you can, kind of have an attitude. It's generally, I've discovered it, like people talk about it in a workplace. Like if you wanted to stop the work in a factory, say, if you're some sort of like, subversive person or whatever, it's like you can complain, you can spread bad morale, you can do these steps. And it seems like some of those things are happening in subreddits and other places by design, as if there have been people planted there to cause some of these conversations to totally go off the rails. Um, do you guys experience that? And if so, how do you handle it? Or can you tell? Is there any way that you can defend against that sort of thing if someone who is a real person develops a username and drops into your subreddit and there's no way to know what their, background or aegis is?
Right. Yeah. Well, this is a major issue because of the anonymity of the internet.
Yeah.
So one of the other subreddits that I was moderating for a while was the Skinwalker Ranch subreddit. And I and the other moderators noticed that there was some really odd behavior that seemed to be coming up over and over again that was very disruptive, but seemed carefully crafted to like not break the rules in an egregious way. And there's a publicly available tool called Reddit Metis, Metis. I think it's also on
Mhm.
GitHub. And one of the best features of it is it looks at the past like 30 days of a user's post activity and generates a heat map. Like what hours of the day are they posting? And we were
I love
started
it.
running this on these suspicious users, and we were like, these users are posting often like 20 hours a day. People need sleep. Like you could maybe do that if you're an insomniac or something, but not for, 2 weeks straight. And we kept seeing it over and over again. We were like, something is really suspicious. And so I and a few other moderators created a custom tool, which is not, for public consumption yet. We're hoping at some point we'll get it there, um, which allowed us to download more information and start trying to find some of these patterns. And we did. We found a lot of patterns of really suspicious behavior. And as you said, because there's this publicly available kind of PSYOP
Yeah.
workbook sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly right.
yeah, a lot of what we were seeing seemed to kind of pull out of that. And the very aggressive skeptic was absolutely one of those kind of personalities that we kept seeing, um, with the ridicule factor being very high. It's not enough to just criticize something, but you have to be like, anyone who would believe this is an idiot or whatever.
Yeah, this whole subreddit's going down the tubes. Like, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But one of the other things that we identified was that there was the other position, which was the extreme believer, who just seemed to accept everything, and then they would come out with really wild statements. Now, some of this stuff you hear with the experiencers just because of the nature of the phenomenon itself. Like, if I said everything that had gone through my mind when I was trying to understand this, it would absolutely sound a bit unhinged, I think, ungrounded, let's call it. Um, so it looked like they were using both sides of that. And then we also identified that these users were engaging with each other a lot of the time. So they weren't just like commenting on a post. They would comment and then they would respond to the comment and respond to the comment. So it was like that was intentionally breaking up the discussions as well.
Yeah.
So then the question is, who is doing this? Like somebody's going to the trouble of either they're doing this for a living, they're posting 8 hours a day, but if it's 20 or 24 hours a day, it's a bot. Someone is programming bots. Why would anyone program a bot to go argue on a UFO subreddit? Well, so of course the obvious thought there was, could it be something related to the intelligence communities? And everybody's heard the rumors and accusations that the intelligence communities are actively trying to disrupt discussion on these topics just to discourage people from looking into it or taking it
Yeah.
seriously.
Yeah.
And we got a chance to talk to Kirk McConnell recently, former member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he didn't have any specific information, but he was like, yeah, we know that they are participating in social media and they're doing these kinds of things. So it is happening and we know what's going on. But I mean, some random moderators, even as a team with custom tools, like trying to fight the intelligence community,
Yeah, good luck.
good luck. Like,
Yeah.
how are we going to deal with that? And so we just tell users, look, just if you see something extreme happening, ignore it. Like, don't even engage with it. Just report it to the moderators and we'll take a look at it and see if we can do anything about it. Otherwise, just like try not to get caught up in it.
It's
One of the
interesting
things
to me.
that, sorry, go ahead, James.
Quick question. Just that, like, we all sit around and talk about the state of the UFO community and describe exactly what you're saying as one of the things that we find so irritating about the community. That we're always at each other's throats, that people are always making these wild claims, that people can't get along, that it's a gigantic noise machine and there's no clarity. And that partly is manufactured, is what you're saying. And that sucks. And it's like, I think we all need to realize to some extent that the bad feeling or the bad sense we get from some of the operators or things that are going on in the community isn't really organic to the subject. It's part of what the framing has been built by people who don't really want people to engage in the conversation. And anyone who's floating over the top of the UFO thing and says, "Oh, I saw this special and it looked really interesting," and then they go on, some forum and they see this conflagration. They're just going to be like, oh, well, yeah, okay, now I remember. These guys are all cuckoo, and I'm just going to totally ignore the topic. And that's where it's working. And so we, like you said, I think we all need to be aware of that. And I think we need to be more forgiving of the community as a whole because we have no idea how much of that is just propped up garbage and not actually a result of people, quibbling who have actual opinions and are real people on the computer. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Chris.
but at the same time, if
Oh,
people think that a lot of the conversations are not genuine, they're not
yeah.
going to want to participate at all. So it really
Yeah,
is a challenge.
sure it is. Absolutely it is. Yeah.
Well, it's a challenge beyond this community. And one of the things that terrifies me about social media in general is its potential for what I would call something like neurolinguistic programming or seeds being planted very, very gradually. I don't want to get too political, but like one of the things that haunts me is say the development of QAnon, which didn't come overnight. It happened very, very gradually through planting of things, co-opting of groups, and suggests subtle nudges, and I know one way to avoid it is to refuse to engage, but that doesn't feel like the correct approach either. And it really requires a hell of a lot of discernment and pattern recognition abilities. And in one world, it could be a beautiful sort of training tool to help people really develop intellectual rigor and look at things really critically. But on the other level, it's also playing to very base psychology and fears and sort of subtle hints. I had to get off X myself earlier this year because I could see myself getting to a point where I'd go, hold on, I've landed at a place that seems absolutely ridiculous, but it happened through such little hops of things that just slightly push you outside of your wheelhouse. And, I'm someone that tries to be fairly politically reflective. So it really worries me. And I don't have an answer. I'm curious as to your response as to how do we make sure that we're actually doing things for the benefit of us collectively as a species and not subject to gradual manipulation by something with a hidden hand?
Well, God, I mean, what a complex question.
Yeah.
Um,
In 5 minutes, please.
yeah, 5 minutes.
I'm usually the one who asks those questions, Chris. You're taking my thunder, man.
Um,
The unanswerable questions, anyway.
well, I think one of the difficulties here is that we don't have a lot of answers with this subject. Short of we know the phenomenon is real. We know that it is engaging with people. Um, and we know that the way that that happens is something unknown. So even that is kind of a question mark. But because of that lack of data, I think, and people are desperate for answers, especially if they're themselves an experiencer of any anomalous phenomenon, they want to know what happened. Like, do they need to be scared? Do they not? What does it mean for the future? Um, and so I think people often will grab onto a narrative that kind of aligns with their worldview. Um, and then once they're locked into that, that's when the problems really start. And because then if some new information comes in that threatens it, they'll respond with aggression. Because that comes out of fear. It's a secondary emotional reaction, is anger. Uh, and you can see this for people who used to be religious, for example, and then changed their views and were like, oh, I felt like I was being duped by the church or whatever. And if you go on any of the subreddits devoted to that, like, ex-Christian or ex-Mormon or whatever, you'll see how angry people are because they felt they were duped and they were scammed. Um, and there's people who will prey on that too. And so we see that as well in the UFO community where, there's groups they're trying to co-opt experiencers who are looking for answers and they're trying to pull them in. And, I mean, sometimes they're straight up cults, but sometimes it's not quite that, definitive. It's just, yeah, it's a really complex thing. And also, I want to remind people that like a lot of people can sound like bots when they're not. They're just
Yeah.
people who are, who may also be scared, or they're just very firm in their opinions and they're very active on Reddit. And again, that works to the advantage of the intelligence community that, now you don't have any trust at all in who is on the other end. And then the accusations begin. Oh, they're a shill, or the term glowy, I guess, it comes out of a game, I guess. I don't know. I'm too old for this.
It's interesting that you mentioned the religious piece there because one of the I don't want to say memes, but ideas that has emerged in the past couple of years, largely attributed to Diana Pasulka, is the idea that ufology or the phenomenon is essentially there's a religiosity or perhaps an emergent religion associated to that, and which implies sort of a belief structure. And I don't know how this is another piece that's one of these really gnarly questions. Like once beliefs enter the picture, by definition, it almost thwarts your ability to critically look at things. So have you had any kind of encounters in navigating those spaces where, this is someone's belief structure, but it's impeding their ability to be critical and objective?
I mean, I think everyone, including myself, falls prey to that, you know? I can give a very personal experience. So one of the things that I had started experimenting with a little over a year ago was EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. And I won't take the half hour to explain how I got into it. But it didn't take long before I realized something genuinely weird was going on there. And I was doing more and more experiments and playing around with it. And I ended up getting in touch with someone on Reddit whose partner had passed away unexpectedly, and they were really struggling. And I'm trying to be careful to navigate this so I don't reveal any information that could be used to track them down. Actually, I don't have to worry about it because they deleted their Reddit account. They had posted on the reincarnation subreddit saying, is it possible my husband was reincarnated as a turtle in my backyard? Now, you can imagine what sort of response that was getting from people. And so I just contacted this person. I was like, just so you know, you don't have to feel like, you're crazy for wondering about these things. And there's been a lot of research, scientific research, it's been done on, afterlife experiences and reincarnation. I was like providing her some sources she could look at on that. Yeah. We just had sort of a back and forth conversation about it. And then I was like, I do EVP work and I could try something. If you wanted to make a recording and send it to me, I could kind of do my thing and see if I get anything out of it and send it back to you. And so she did. She sent me 15-minute recording and I got like 250 messages, discrete sentences or whatever out of this. And now I didn't know this person. And a lot of the stuff didn't make any sense to me, but I sent it back to her and I was like, any of this mean anything to you? Well, it turned out it had the name of her husband. It had the name of her kids. She had previously been very devoutly religious, and it had content related to that. And you could see the ontological shock happening while we were having the discussion. And she was like, could this mean this? And what is this? And is this, and I was like, I don't know what any of it is. And trust me, it is not straightforward. Please be very careful in taking this in. I don't know what is going on, genuinely. But it could be these things. And ultimately, her response was to finally get furiously angry with me and tell me that all of it was crazy BS. And then she deleted the entire conversation we had on Discord. She deleted her Reddit account, everything else. And it was because she had formerly been a religious person. She had left, and now she was terrified of getting suckered again. And she saw the UFO thing and the spiritual components that seem to be related to it as another way that she was going to get suckered. And so her life experience gave her that response. I don't know where she's at right now. I hope she's feeling in a safer space wherever she landed on it. But yeah, it took me a while, even though I'd been through all of this kind of stuff myself and I'm around it all the time, to sort of figure out exactly what had happened. And I was like, man, I gave her too much too fast, and I didn't ground it enough for her. So there is a spiritual component to this stuff, and I don't know how it's connected. It seems to all be connected. Jacques Vallée, the cover of his book, Messengers of Deception, it's got like the masks. And they revised the book cover, and now it's like, it's not even a person holding the masks. It's a shadow holding, like even that is another layer of the sort of trickster element. We don't know what it is we're dealing with.
I appreciate one thing about your subreddit, and you kind of displayed it here with the story you just told, where the moderators often get involved with folks who have experiences and seem to be on the raw end sometimes of processing that. Like, I remember one story in particular, I won't go into any great detail, but the person who reported it sounded really freaked out and was talking about some things that had happened that were really deeply unsettling to her, to them. And one of the moderators was like, DM me and let's have a conversation off the boards, and I can sort of help you, figure out ways to sort of think about this. And I thought that was profound, over the top as far as what a lot of moderators would do on a lot of subreddits. And I wonder if you could offer up, I mean, I don't want to, like, sort of the generic statement you'd make to someone who is having some experience like this that they can't quantify as either religious or extraterrestrial or any of those things. What do you tell people who were previously skeptical, but are now encountering this strange thing and they don't know what to do with it? What can you say to help ground them or give them some direction forward?
First of all, I want to give a shout out to the co-founder and co-moderator, Oak Driocht. He's in Ireland, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. He was almost certainly the one who DM'd this person.
He was.
That's what he spends all of his time doing, is connecting with people one-on-one, often on video calls or audio calls, and just sort of talking them through it and, calming them down. And the biggest way of doing that is just saying, look, you're not alone. Like, no matter how wild the thing is that you think you experienced, chances are somebody else has experienced something similar to that. Like, they tend to be very unique experiences, and there's always a lot of very personal elements to it. But there are also a lot of commonalities. And so just often knowing, like, you're not alone. Other people experience this and they get through it, And a lot of the kind of the insiders that I've talked with, like major names in this field, are experiencers themselves. But also a lot of them don't want to acknowledge to what degree they're experiencers. Like, they'll talk maybe a little bit about some of it, but they won't talk about the bulk of it because the stigma is still too high. But it's getting better. And I think our subreddit is helping with that. And that I'm proud of. that we're trying to normalize this conversation as much as a thing like this can be normalized, of just saying, just because you experience these things that don't make any sense doesn't mean they didn't happen.
Yeah.
And eventually we'll figure it out.
Do you advise people to come forward with their experiences, either anonymously on the subreddit, obviously, or even more publicly? Or do you think that that can be destructive? Do you have any input at all for people on that score?
I think it can be very, very helpful to talk about these things. I think doing it anonymously on Reddit right now is a safer way to go because that stigma is still really high. I've lost, lifelong friends over my beliefs, my shifting beliefs on this subject. It can be hard to talk about with family members, people have lost jobs and stuff, but a lot of the damage comes when people struggle to process it and they just kind of lose their grounding and they're worried about going to a mental health professional because they're like, I don't know how they're going to treat me or whatever. I think just getting people through that initial ontological shock phase is often the most critical aspect of it.
You find that there are certain pieces that are easier to talk about or more readily acceptable in this. I'll give you an example of what partly got me into this work was I did some work with ketamine therapy through a therapeutic program to help with anxiety and depression. And as I started to talk about my experiences with the psychedelics, with safe colleagues, I would have folks that would kind of like, creep in, look around, see who else was listening, and then tell me about something that had happened when a family member had, say, died, because death often has an association with this. That seemed to be, semi-socially acceptable. And yet I've never had anyone tell me, or at least at work, for example, that they'd seen a UAP or had an alien encounter. So there seems to be like, from personal experience, degrees of stigma. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Do you see things that are making their way into being acceptable, and others that are still, we can't touch this radioactive topic?
Yeah. Again, I blame the intelligence community for a lot of this because they made, and declassified documents have shown this, they made the decision back in the 60s, might have even been earlier, to stigmatize the topic because they did not want people looking into it. They did not want anybody discussing it or taking it seriously because they didn't know what it was.
Starting
And
with
from
Grudge, back in the
yeah,
early
yeah.
50s, yeah.
So from a national security perspective, they were like, the safest thing is if nobody figures this out before we do. And so they created a lot of that stigma. I think the things that are most acceptable to talk about are the things that are kind of already out there in the zeitgeist. Gray aliens in your bedroom at night, or seeing the object in the sky that moves in a way that you're not quite sure what it was. It's not definitively a UFO, but it could have been. But those are such a small portion of what people experience, and the bleed over. Like, this is one of the other things that was shocking to me was my own experiences. I was like, I'm experiencing so many different things here. I must be crazy. I must be. Like, no person has remote viewing and the clairaudience and, precognition and aliens and like, what the hell? There's no way. Well, when you look at the Venn diagram of poltergeists and haunted houses and, UFOs and everything, it starts approaching a single circle because the overlap in terms of when people describe their experiences fully, they have a lot in common. And people like Diana Pasulka are hitting on this when they're saying, there is a spiritual kind of religious component to this. And, there was the free survey from the Edgar Mitchell Foundation.
Yeah.
It was the largest survey ever of experiencers to date, with over, I think, 4,000 respondents. And one of the people who worked with that survey noted, this is Ray Hernandez, noted the comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah. You look at near-death experiences and contact experiences, and again, it's like one of them just has an alien kind of UFO space setting, and the other one is a kind of an afterlife setting. Well, other than that, the experiences are kind of interchangeable in a lot of ways. The communications that people are given are very, very similar. It's just a difference in where it's coming from.
It's like an engagement with the transcendent, and it's trying to reach us through different modalities, as they say, contact modalities. And that's what we encounter as all the different phenomena, which is a fascinating idea. I would like to pivot a little bit to current events just for a moment. We've been, as a community, everyone's been wrestling with the Jake Barber story and all the stuff that's come out about that. And one of the things that he's been talking a lot about are what he calls psionic assets, people who are psychic, I guess, and have a predisposition to making some sort of contact and to being able to manipulate their consciousness in a way that allows them to deploy it like a sensor system. Is basically how he describes it in his latest interview with Jesse Michael. My thought, well, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I wonder if there's any risk in, basically considering people with certain abilities as assets. I mean, that language itself is sort of problematic. And there's a story about going to Indonesia and recruiting some folks there that Jake Barber comments on in his most recent interview about there is some reality to that we go to third world countries and we find experiencers or people who are talented and we invite them back. It's not coercive, but they come willingly. But anyway, do you have any thoughts on how that might be problematic, or are there any misunderstandings arising out of that whole story that you'd like to clear up in terms of understanding psi phenomenon or anything else?
Yeah, so one of the areas that I focused a lot on with my research was parapsychology and the study of psi, um, primarily just because there was so much scientific research on it. There's not a lot of UFOs and abduction experiences. I mean, there's some going back to the 80s, but in terms of recent stuff, there's not a lot of published work, but there's a huge amount on parapsychology. And I think the first thing to note is that it seems most people have psychic ability. Pretty much everyone seems to display some degree of psychic ability, but it's generally very weak. And so you don't even notice that it's happening. Like one of the biggest psi experiments, it's been replicated hundreds of times all over the world, is the Gansfeld experiment. And in short, they give somebody, you have four choices you could make. And by chance, you should get 25%. Statistically, on average, people get 33% accurate. And that's been replicated over and over again. So they're like, something is going on here, but it's not a super strong effect on average. But if you find certain people that seem to be more in tune with these innate abilities, they're just more talented, the way you could be better at a sport or playing a piano or whatever. They can do things better in that regard, but there's still limits. Like the parapsychology research showed that even like the best remote viewers that they could find had like a 65% accuracy rate that they could achieve with, devoted training for years. But the biggest problem is that they couldn't tell the difference between when they were getting a hit and when they were getting a miss. And this carries over to all of psi, like whether it's remote viewing or mediumship or whatever, people do get hits, but they can't tell when they're getting a hit or getting a miss because of the way it's experienced. It's very, imaginative, I guess I would say. It's that confabulation again.
Right.
So when the government is, finding these people, they're looking for anything that like, what sort of things might correlate with people being better. Well, the research showed that, there was a little bit of a kick when people were left-handed, or, women tend to do a little bit better than men. That doesn't mean that only women, can do psi, obviously. But people are looking at this stuff now and they're trying to understand, like, are there people like Seven from Stranger Things out there? Is it like that? It's like, no. If If there are, we haven't found them. But everybody seems to be psychic to some degree. And like any other ability, if you play with it, you can improve it.
One of the things that you'll hear, and this comes from the telepathy tapes from the reports of, say, the kids, is that belief seems to be a factor in accessing this, which I find struggling with this in the sense that, one of the things I would say to people who are skeptical of this is, okay, well then if we all have these abilities, go try. But does it not work if you're not sufficiently open-minded? I wonder if do you see any of that, or is it something that anyone could genuinely convince themselves up if they went and gave themselves a fair shot, even from a semi-skeptical perspective?
Absolutely can. Matter of fact, I got a chance to speak to Hal Puthoff recently, who is one of the people who ran the CIA's remote viewing program. And he said that they found that people who were pretty strong skeptics tended to ultimately have the best performance.
Mm-hmm.
But if people are deniers, what the research has shown is that they score worse than chance. It's psi
Yeah,
missing.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, yeah. So their brain is subconsciously reinforcing their existing beliefs using data they're getting psychically. But what I would say, anybody who wants to experiment with this, remote viewing seems to be the easiest and most reliable way of doing it. And there's guides all over the place online on how to do it. And there's not only one way to do it. But give it a try. A lot of people, there's like that, the first time you do it, often they get the best results.
It's interesting, that belief piece, because that's something that people have been talking about for years. Various researchers, that like people who do believe tend to have more success, it seems like. And I think I don't know what that says about reality, but I think that well, I guess I do know what it says about reality. I think that it says that we help shape it, and I think that goes back to what you were saying about, you know, what are we in, like our friends would say, that we're trying to get at with all of these questions. I think that there's some fundamental, and that's sort of like one of the things that irritates me about the whole conflagration of conversations and everything, is that where are we going with all of this? Like, what's the ultimate realization that humanity is kind of working toward? And I find myself obsessed with that question. So I spend a lot of time reading about, like, um, you know, uh, some spiritual traditions or quantum physics. Like, I'm reading a book now by Paul Levy, The Quantum Revelation, and he's not a physicist, but he put together this massive tome of like all these quotes from early physicists about the nature of the quantum, and in particular Wheeler he focuses heavily on. But his whole notion is that it's participatory universe. And I find that utterly fascinating. And I wonder if that's kind of ultimately where we're going to end up with this, is some sort of merging between what we've considered spirituality and science, and end up in a place where consciousness is sort of primary to what builds up out of nothing, and that we're all even subconsciously shapers of that. Do you have any thought on that kind of ontological question and can you help us figure out where you've arrived with that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you look at the history of quantum physics, that the earliest researchers on this, like Baum and Wheeler, um, believed that the observer was critical to the collapse of the wave function. Like, it was consciousness. It wasn't the measurement. Now, of course, the whole view is shifted towards materialism, where physicists will say, no, 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 it has nothing to do with consciousness or observing it. But that wasn't the initial view. And I think we've made a big misstep in sort of letting our beliefs about the nature of reality be dictated by a scientific apparatus that was entirely built around measuring physical phenomenon. And it's persuaded us that everything comes out of the physical, and it's like, well, this is the big thing about studying these topics, is it challenges that. And I think that's why there's so much pushback on it. But the data is so reliable overall. There's so much of it. And I say reliable. Now, the thing is, there are problems with replication on some of these experiments. And curiously, um, there is something called the experimenter effect, or the sheep goat effect in parapsychology, where the people who are conducting the experiments will sometimes not get any results at all. There was a famous joint experiment between this parapsychologist, Marilyn Schlitz, and a pronounced skeptic, Richard Wiseman. Marilyn Schlitz had done a study to see if people could tell when they were being stared at, you know? And she did the study, she published the results. He looked at it and he was like, I can't find any problem with the methodology, but there's no way that people could do this. So he contacted her and was like, let's do the experiment together. And so they did. It was all the same methodology, the same pool of subjects. Everything was exactly the same facilities and everything. She got a positive result statistically, and he didn't. And that has been replicated in parapsychology to the point where they're like, we know that belief does play some sort of role in this, but we don't really know how that works. And so I think it's important to try and stay open-minded about this stuff and not go into it with the very strong beliefs one way or the other, because we don't know how that's affecting what we're experiencing. The idea of the multiverse theory, like maybe you're ending up in the universe where none of it is pronounced because you don't believe in it. I don't know.
Kind of afraid to, but maybe we should ask for input from the actual physicist in the room. Chris?
Oh,
Oh gosh. I mean, I go back and forth on this, to be perfectly honest. I haven't landed, and part of it is because I haven't had the breadth of personal experiences to fully convince me. I'm trying to be open-minded, and to me, some of it comes from earnest dialogue, face to face with people. And it's one of the things I was actually thinking about as we were reflecting on Reddit here with people, is that when you actually have the face-to-face dialogue and you look at people's body language and you can tell that they are having these experiences, um, that's credible, but yet these are individual data points, and the nature of the experiences seem to defy experimental explanation. And so I kind of grapple with going back and forth between what I would call like materialism plus, which is basically your basic physics, and then some of the psi stuff is electromagnetic, versus something which is entirely idealistic, consciousness focused, where if you believe and you set up apparatus that which would demonstrate, physicalism, it will behave that way, which solves all of it. But that's a really big it is a really big jump to ask people to let go of the physicalist reality. And I was going to actually ask you, Charles, we talk a lot about paradigm shifts in science, and it sort of feels like we're on the cusp of that. And usually, historically, it's been some kind of an experiment or something that is kind of irrefutable, that just flat out breaks the old theory, that flips something. And I've been trying to grapple with, okay, what is it that is convincing to people that would lead us to reject this? And I haven't come across anything definitive yet, because it is so hard to replicate upon command, other than to invite people to try to approach this open-mindedly and see what happens. Because for me, my experience on ketamine was what was required for me to take on a lot of the stuff beyond the nuts and bolts, at least even be open to it. I still don't know where I'm landing, and I'm still very much grappling with my own ontological shock of it, which is why I'm hesitant to come down on anything right now.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what would you think? Do you have a prediction for what might really flip over the apple cart? What area of this discipline would do it?
I think the reason why we haven't had, as Jeffrey Kripal would call it, the flip, is because we're asking people to give up an ontology and replace it with question marks.
Yeah.
Why would they do that? Like, the ontology of physicalism works pretty darn well.
Yeah.
Most of the time, unless you're an experiencer. Pretty much everyone I know who gave it up, it's because they had an anomalous experience that simply didn't fit. I'm kind of enamored with things like quantum Bayesianism, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it, and relational quantum mechanics, the idea that people could be literally having some almost like a different reality that only has to conform to whatever allows them to participate in, something together, I guess. I'm destroying that, trying to explain it. But the experiences that people have, particularly in isolation, that seems to be where things can get
Mhm.
really strange. But there are times when people will experience things together. But even then, sometimes they will, like two people will perceive something anomalous, but they'll perceive completely different things.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of stuff that people like Gary Nolan and Jim Segala are talking about because they're trying to get the data on this. And they're like, even the data doesn't make a lot of sense. But there is data. Like Jim Segala created this device, the MUPUS, which is this suite of sensors measuring electromagnetics and ionizing radiation and all kinds of stuff. And he has found that there are signals that correlate with people having anomalous experience, including bursts of gamma radiation, which there's nothing in the environment that should be randomly producing strong bursts of gamma radiation. And he
Hopefully.
claims that it correlates with anomalous experience to like 99.9% confidence, where he can even determine whether it was going to be a positive experience or a negative experience. But it seems to be happening like he's measuring this stuff like 5 days in advance of when people are having the experience.
Hmm.
I have a Geiger counter that has an alarm on it, and it's gone off twice in the past year because the level of, gamma radiation was high enough to trigger like a safety alarm.
Hmm.
And it didn't seem to correlate with a gamma ray burst or anything like a cosmic burst. I don't know what it would have been, but it did correlate with anomalous experience. So
Hmm.
I'm waiting on my Mupus.
Are you gonna get one?
I
Does he?
am. Yeah,
Wow.
he's run into production difficulties, so there's a backlog. But I've been working on a research project with Jim for a year. And no, I'm not getting it for free, but I
Yeah.
was one of the first in line, I guess.
Is there anything you can say about that project, or is that top secret?
No, it's not top secret. It's going to be a survey for experiencers. We're really trying to learn more. As I said, the last big one was the Edgar Mitchell Foundation. That was over a decade ago. Uh,
And
I
and
think that's
so,
so valuable. I mean, I think that's. I mean, Peter Skafish was talking about something like that for Soul. I think that the more information we can get from the people who are actually having these experiences, the more data, the better we'll be able to hopefully field a theory that will replace those question marks, right? I mean, if we can make an ontology that is, complementary with the material aspects of reality that we see, but then accommodates all these, anomalous experiences, hopefully people might be able to make a flip
and
more easily.
I'll offer a potential way forward from a science perspective. So my background is in really the physics of climate. And if you look at how people have presented the evidence for climate change, there's a huge amount of noise. Any one study, can be questioned here, but it's the pattern you assemble together from all of this that starts to become convincing. And so they're the kind of the gold standard reports, or what are called the IPCC International Panel on Climate Change reports. And these are like 1,000-page plus books, and there are 3 volumes in there. And the first one is just the physical science basis. And what they will do is they'll say claim, 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 and then they'll lay down all of the studies that would support that claim, and then they will have people assess sort of a probabilistic assessment of this. So I think you could do a lot of this with the paranormal field, evidence for clairvoyance. So these are the studies that show it. We gather a bunch of open-minded people together and we assess, okay, what is the strength of the belief in this? And then, areas where there's fuzziness points the way forward to new research. And you don't even need to necessarily attach an ontological framework to it. It's simply you start with, here are seemingly the objective data points here. Let's try to get some community consensus on that. And then we can have a separate volume once we've got the data points that are most, compelling, to try to stitch them together into a narrative. And it's not a one pass at this thing. You iterate and you iterate on this. And sometimes you change your findings as new things come forward. But there is a way to break it down. And like with how the climate change stuff goes, there's also the lens from the humanities about how are we actually going to implement and adaptations, or what are the social considerations to bring people on board. There's a beautiful way of wedding, the psychology of convincing people and building a reliable case with the actual more quantitative data there. So I would hope that if academia really starts to take this seriously, that might be an approach we could take.
well, and they have tried that like there was a meta study that was done by Etzel Cardania I think it was 2017, no, more recent than that, that it was published, uh, looking at statistical evidence supportive of psi. And he said statistically it meets the standards. And the rebuttal that was published by two prominent skeptics, the argument that they put forth was that data is totally irrelevant because psi is not compatible with the
Mm.
current scientific paradigm.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
that's kind of where it's been for 30 years is it's like the evidence is there, but we can't get past the hurdle because it's not compatible. So until somebody can figure out, well, how is it compatible? I think we're stuck. And I am so glad that, we've got researchers now who are looking at this in relation to UAP, coming at it from a new perspective, because they've got sensor data from very, very high quality sensors, which unfortunately is classified. But now citizen scientists are starting to make things, uh, UFO DAP and
Yeah.
similar devices to start collecting sensor data on this. And the MUPUS.
Jessica
We're on the
Utz.
cusp of something. Yeah, Jessica Utz.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she was the head of the Statistical Society or whatever, the American, Professional Association for Statistics, and said that on any other subject, if you comprehensively looked at all the statistics that were generated through all of the psi experiments over the last 100 years, it would be proven. But because it's psi and because it's outside of our physicalist framework, it's considered nonsense. So it's
Yeah,
interesting.
and she said we should stop trying to prove it and we should now shift to trying to understand it. She said there's no point in trying to prove it anymore. That's been done. It's just, you know, you're reinventing the wheel.
Another correlation to draw is that like climate change, um, I'm convinced of climate change. You're obviously convinced of climate change. The world scientists are convinced of climate change. But if you took a poll in the United States, it's what, somewhere a little less than half remain unconvinced. It's like it's become such a political issue and so tarred with all of this garbage that we find online that is just like people targeting this issue with their opinions and manipulation and all of that, that we never really settle in on an answer, even though there is an answer. And part of me worries that that's where this subject could be headed, since it's already so polluted by, people who are trying to shape the conversation. Are we ever going to be able to settle on an answer that is just, okay, we can walk away and know that this is real? It doesn't seem like they're going to allow us to do that. That's unfortunate.
Well, I think, everybody is coming at it from a different direction, but a lot of people who are willing to put money into it, the people who have money to put into it, they're looking for a return on their investment. Like, what are we going to get back out of this? How can we monetize this? And that's real problematic because then it raises accusations of grifters, you know? And so like what's happening with Mick West? He got somebody who was willing to pay for him to develop this tool to give us a better understanding of what's going on, which is laudable. But now he's being called a grifter for it. And there's plenty of things that I criticize about, the way Mick West comes at things, but I also have an understanding of his own resistance, I think. Um, but yeah, I think drama, unfortunately, gets attention, and social media makes it very easy to generate drama.
Yeah, and desirable.
Yeah.
It's like the most important thing because it drives traffic or whatnot. It's, the society we live in. That's pretty much all the questions I had. Chris, do you have any questions that you want to throw out there?
No, I hear a desire to be open-minded while also critical, which I think is commendable in this field. And I also really appreciate what I heard was a lot of compassion, which I think is just in very short supply these days. And I appreciate having people like you out there that are caring for experiencers because it's so important for that. Just want to express appreciation and thank you for the time today.
Well, thank you. And I hope people find our subreddit to be supportive and helpful. And for people who are new to it, definitely check it out.
I would encourage people to do so. It's r/experiencers on Reddit. And Charles, MantisAwakening, is one of the moderators, just to remind folks. And I appreciate you. You are, I was trying to think of a male version of kind of a medulla or a doula or a midwife, because I sort of see that as what you're doing with the subreddit. You're giving birth to this like permission for folks to engage in this topic that is transformative, and it's important work and heroic and a lot of things. So thank you so much for all you do and for taking the time today to join us.
Well, thank you very much for letting me share some thoughts on this topic.